Welcome back, guys, to my Brazilian Grand Prix race weekend review. And it was a very good weekend for racing this. When you look at the whole season, where overtaking has been very difficult, this race has really shown why Interlagos is easily in the top two tracks of the calendar. Because the cars actually were able to overtake. I know, crazy, right? But yeah, before I dive into anything, could I please kindly just ask everyone to like and subscribe if you like the content? It really helps me um, find the motivation to keep doing these. So I'd appreciate it if you guys did that. But with that done, let's dive straight in to my Rawesome driver of the weekend. And that would be the one and only Max Verstappen. And I know that there's going to be lots of people saying that it should be Lando Norris, right? I'm very, very much aware of that. And I don't necessarily disagree either. He did win every session. But the reason why I haven't put Lando Norris is because, in my opinion, the manner of the wins, based off of how strong that McLaren looked in the qualifying sessions and historically across the season, I was a bit not underwhelmed, but I feel like he could have done more. I don't think Lando drove a perfect weekend. I think the car and Lando had a strong weekend, but I don't think, like, in the sprint race, very close to Antonelli, having a chance at the win, which, in a McLaren versus a Mercedes, I don't know, that to me, it didn't feel like a dominating win, because, like, comparing to Mexico, for example, where Lando was absolutely the best driver, I don't think this win was particularly amazing. And same with the main race, where even Lando himself says it. You look at Max, which is why I've put him. He starts in the pit lane, finishes third, 10 seconds behind the lead. Norris started on pole, didn't have a contest the entire fight, the entire race. Like, nobody was battling him, and he's only 10 seconds ahead. And Verstappen had a puncture, had to pit an extra time to everyone else. I just, I think Lando had a very good weekend. I just think what Max Verstappen did in the main race beats that for me. And the reason why, because again, people will draw up the fact that he qualified 16th, but to me, that Red Bull, especially for the sprint race, it looks so hard to drive, and he's still able to pull these results out. Like fourth in the sprint in that car that looked terrible is it's just impressive. I don't think anyone. I mean, they did change the setup on a new engine for the race, so it's hard to say for that. But I do still think the McLaren was the fastest car this weekend, and he's managed to recover so well from a pit lane start. As I said, in regulations where it is difficult to follow. I know that we did have a lot of overtaking at this track, but it doesn't change the fact that it is difficult to follow in dirty air. So that's why I've picked Max Verstappen. I just think, whilst it wasn't necessarily a perfect weekend, I think the highs, the peaks of it, way outweigh the only real negative, which I'd say was the qualifying session. I think the sprint race he maximised that. So that's why I've chosen Max. I'll understand if people want Lando, but I also have an honourable mention of Pierre Gasly, because he has done a really, like, under the radar, I guess, in terms of, like, big talking points, but, like, an under the radar weekend where he scored points in both the sprint and the main race in an Alpine that hasn't had any upgrades and has comfortably been finishing races in 19th and 20th, way off at the back. And I just think that's massively impressive that he's finished 8th in the sprint and 10th in the main race. And that 10th, he wasn't too far off of the Lawson on the one stop. So I think Gasly's had a very impressive weekend, leagues ahead of Colapinto, may I also say, who I know he got his contract renewed, and it's the safe option for Alpine, and it stops them from having any sort of negative press, negative PR. But I do strongly refute people who say Colapinto's close to Gasly, because when you're the back two cars on the grid, and people are saying that like, oh, he's way better than Gasly because he outqualified him 19th compared to 20th. I mean, you know, I just don't take that as, oh, he's doing a great job, he's better. Like, at the back, there's zero motivation really from 19th and 20th. Weekends like this is where you see the best of Gasly, where the car can actually be competitive, and when the car is competitive, Colapinto's nowhere. He was nowhere the whole weekend. So look, it's a safe decision from Alpine, but I don't think Colapinto's that amazing personally. But that moves us on to my extinct driver of the weekend, and there's two that I've picked, but I think they're quite clear as to the two I've picked, and you've probably predicted it by now. And the first one is Gabriel Bortoleto. Not much needs to be said. Huge crash in the sprint race, which was quite an unnecessary crash as well. Like, it was the last lap, I believe, and overtaking for 11th. It was in not a great move. Very much a rookie mistake, that. And for the main race, of course, it wasn't really his fault, in the sense that I believe it was Stroll that just spun him around. But still, you can't really deny the fact that he didn't even do qualifying. He didn't finish either of the races, and his sprint qualifying was mediocre. So, look, it pains me to say it, because for him at his home race, I'm sure he was hoping for a lot more, but it really was just anonymous. If he was a different driver and it wasn't his home race, like, literally people would forget he existed this weekend. It's only because it's his home race and there was a bit of buzz around the fact that he wanted to do well. That's the only reason why it was relevant. Like, he literally did nothing this weekend. So that's why I've picked Bortoleto. But I think the other one, and again, it's quite clear, it's Lewis Hamilton. And I'm going to get into this in a later section, so stay tuned for that. But I'll briefly just say that he's just, dare I say, washed. Like, I know that the excuse comes out, or the reasoning comes out when you say this, and people are like, oh, it's his first year in a new team, first year in Ferrari, like, that's why he's off the pace. But he is massively off the pace. I'd understand that if it was, you know, a little bit, maybe like a tenth, 2/10 off of Leclerc. But no, he's getting knocked out in crucial sessions. Like, out in sprint qualifying too. And then a really weird rookie mistake of just taking off his front wing in the race. On the back of the Alpine, I think it was. And look, I don't rate Lewis Hamilton anymore. I really don't. Like, it's clear that Charles Leclerc comfortably has his number. And look, it'll all be concluded next year, because if next year it's the same, then yikes. It's a clear sort of 1 and 2 driver at Ferrari if it continues. But that wraps it up for my extinct drivers. And now I'll just briefly talk about the weekend as a whole, where there's a couple sort of talking points I want to have. And I want to start with Oscar Piastri's 10-second penalty, crashing into Antonelli and then crashing into Leclerc. And I know maybe for some people this is going to be controversial, but I personally think that 10-second penalty is absolutely ridiculous. And I do urge people to watch the replay and the onboard of Piastri's car, because I don't really think he does anything majorly wrong there. If you notice, he is well alongside Antonelli before the braking zone. he actually breaks relatively early compared to the others. You can watch that he loses his advantage on Antonelli. He's still next to Antonelli in a car, Antonelli's car, but he does brake earlier to make the corner. But then you just watch Antonelli's line, and he just turns in as if no one's there. And then people bring up the fact that Piastri locked up. Again, watch the replay. Piastri locked up because he realised Antonelli was turning in on him, and he tried to brake and turn, which is how you lock up, to avoid that. And there was nowhere to avoid it because there's a barrier on the inside. So I really don't understand how that was portioned to all Piastri. Like, he had a great run. He had every right to go up the inside there. And then Antonelli just turns in as if he doesn't exist. And I think they've just looked at whatever the stewards have done. They've just looked at the fact he locked up and are like, oh, well, he wasn't in control of his car. And they've looked at the consequences of the fact that it's taken out Leclerc. And they're like, oh, well, it must be Piastri's fault. But I strongly disagree with that. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say Antonelli deserves a penalty, but at the bare minimum, it's a racing incident. Because where Piastri had the right to go for that, and where is he meant to go? It really wasn't a dive bomb. Like, he literally broke earlier. He lost some of that side-by-side advantage going into the corner, so he made it on a tighter line. And then Antonelli just turns in on his front axle. Like, I don't agree with that penalty at all. And it would have made the race at least a bit more interesting with Piastri without the 10-second penalty. So, for me, that's a big sort of stewarding, like, failure. Because I cannot get behind that penalty. I'm sorry, but I can't. It's not fair for Piastri that he went for a move. It was a very reasonable racing move, and he's just given no space when Antonelli had space on his outside. So that's my thoughts on that. And then I'd also like to sort of talk about some of the midfield drivers, like standout performances. And I mean, Ollie Bearman, man, like, wow, he's just had a really great last two races. And I don't want to get that muddled with the fact that as a season as a whole, he hasn't had an amazing season. So I'm trying not to let the last two races, like, blind that. Like, you need to take into account that if he doesn't continue this form, which he might, but if he doesn't, it is kind of, you know, he's had a lot of inconsistency this season. But at the current form, he is very, very strong. Like, he comfortably finished 6th, and I know that's slightly flattered by the fact that people kind of got bottled up behind the one-stoppers, so he naturally got a massive lead from that, because he'd always be faster on a two-stop. But regardless, like, 6th for Haas is incredible, and it takes them further ahead of Sauber in the standings, closer to Aston Martin, I believe, who we don't talk about their main race. Like, just side note, how the hell does this team go from comfortably SQ3 and very strong and does well in the sprint race to the main race literally absolutely useless? Like, how? I swear, I despair supporting Aston Martin because I get so hopeful on the Saturdays, being like, oh my god, they're actually competitive. And then you go into the main race, and it's like, no, they're not. They're just probably the 7th fastest team. It always happens. I'm losing my patience with Aston Martin, but who cares? They wrote off this year anyways. But I'd also like to sort of lastly talk about the context of the championship. And I do think, all things normal, Norris has this sealed. So, yeah, I'll go into it a bit more in a bit. But I think very ominous weekend for people who want to see a 3-way title fight. So that's sort of my main race recap. Very, very good Brazil Grand Prix. Lots of battling, lots of overtakes. it helped that Max started from the pit lane because it naturally gave that sort of intrigue of watching a driver carve through the field. So very good for Brazil. Hasn't missed in quite a few years. So it'll be a shame that it doesn't have a sprint race next year. I really don't know why they haven't. I don't know why they've done that. I genuinely don't, because this track just lends itself to racing, and I think it's disappointing that we'll have less competitive track sessions next year. But regardless, still an amazing race. And that's us moving on to the question of, is it championship over? And I think it is, personally. People will wonder, like, what does Oscar Piastri need to do? What does Max Verstappen need to do in order to win this? And it goes back to just the pure, blunt, mathematical outcome, where if Lando comes second in every race, he's won the championship now, regardless of what the other two do. So I think in that sense, Las Vegas is the main sort of bottle in that could be a risk for him not performing, because McLaren haven't historically been very good there. But I think all things normal, when Norris doesn't have a massive drop-off in pace and doesn't crash every race, he comfortably has this. A 24-point gap. If he manages to fumble this, especially to an Oscar Piastri, who he was better this weekend in Brazil, but still off the pace. So if he fumbles that to Oscar, let alone Max, who was 2 race wins behind, pretty much. So if he doesn't win this, it's genuinely a massive bottle, because he's got the momentum, he's got the form, he's got the best car. I just don't see how he doesn't win this, because Max Verstappen realistically needs a win and Norris DNFing, and then 2 really strong last races where he outscores him. And then Piastri kind of needs the same. He needs a Lando DNF, he wins, and then 2 strong races better than Norris. So look, it's not looking good for a 3-way fight. You can still kind of count Oscar in it, but I think Las Vegas is going to be really telling, in the sense that if Norris does well there, I do genuinely think it's done for, because that track is the last one on the calendar that you look at and think, oh, the McLaren might not be good there. Whereas Qatar and Abu Dhabi, both of those tracks, you look at them and you're like, the McLaren isn't going to be terrible there, which is what it's what Max Verstappen needs to happen, but also it's what Piastri needs to happen to have a chance to gain big points on Norris. Because if Piastri's finishing first and Norris is second, it makes no difference. He needs a big point swing. So I think a really bad weekend in the sense of the context of the championship, because it does just take that sting out of it, because pragmatically looking at it, Max is out of it, Oscar is teetering on the edge of being out of it, and it just makes the season boring. Like, it really was a shame that we had sort of like a fever dream of sort of 4 races where Max was winning everything and the championship gap was closing down. But I think that's kind of masked the fact that this season has just been terrible. Like, now that sort of fever dream isn't looking like a reality, it just really needs to make everyone revert back to how terrible this season is. Because it's just, apart from the last 4 races-ish, it's just not been exciting at the front. It hasn't. And I think that's why everyone was so excited and so behind Max Verstappen doing well, because it would make the season way more interesting. But that's not going to happen now, it's looking like. So I just think it's really a shame for this year. And my personal opinion, between the 2 McLaren drivers, either or, like, I'm not biasing myself here. I class both of them in the same category, in the sense that I don't think either of them deserve to be a world champion this year. I think it sort of comes back to the fact that they've had the dominant car, and you need to compare it to sort of like, I don't know, maybe a driver like Jenson Button winning in the Brawn, where it was so massively overpowered at the start of the season. I think that's how I sort of class this. I don't class Jenson Button as like an amazing driver. He's good. He's good. Don't get me wrong. He's not bad. But I don't class him as world championship level for me personally. And that's how I'll look at both McLaren drivers, regardless of the outcome this season, because both of them have just fumbled it way too hard at different points of the season. Whether that's Norris at the beginning of the season or Piastri at this point of the season. And I just compare it to championships like Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen, where you don't see them making just these terrible mistakes so often on their championship winning years. And that's what's so impressive behind those drivers, and is what made you realise that they're some of the greats. But with these McLaren drivers, they've had very few performances where you just look at it and you're like, wow, he's amazing. Because it's always negated by the fact that maybe in the same weekend, or even the next weekend or the weekend previously, they've made some stupid mistake, and it just negates their successful races, like Norris in Mexico, or, I don't know, Piastri in Saudi, I guess, maybe. It just negates that, because you look at it and you're like, wow, he's got good speed, but you question, without the fastest car, would he really be doing that? And I think that's kind of the crux of it, because I think if Max had, if in some alternate universe there were 3 McLaren cars and Max was the third driver, I think Max would win this championship comfortably over them, because they're just too prone to stupid mistakes. And I'm not discrediting the fact that, as I said, they've got really, really high peaks, but I just think as a complete driver package, I think they're largely elevated by their car this year, and that's what's put them in contention, not their driver skill. I don't think either of them have the driver skill to be world champion. I think if you put Max Verstappen, George Russell, Charles Leclerc, Fernando Alonso, etc., I think all of those drivers have championship qualities. I don't see that in either McLaren driver, unfortunately. And I think it's unfortunate as well that they are going to win it because of the fastest car. I don't think anyone likes that in a championship, because like there's always the questions of 2020, for example, where, you know, was Hamilton really that dominant, or was it just completely the car? And I think championships like that, and even like Max in 23, where you kind of at least had the argument that he was way outperforming his teammate, like way, like a lot. But I think those kind of championships are the sort of most, the hardest to determine whether the driver's actually that good, because the McLaren, apart from some races this year, has comfortably been the fastest. And I just, look, I know it's harsh, it's a harsh take for me to have, but I just don't see them as champions. I don't, due to how many mistakes they make. But, you know, that's my opinion on that. And that kind of leads me on to my next question, which is, should Ferrari be looking at Bearman over Hamilton? And look, I think absolutely, personally. And it's quite simple in the sense that Hamilton is, forget about the Ferrari stint, right? Like, even just go back to his Mercedes days so you can get rid of that excuse of people saying, oh, well, it's a new car. 2024 Hamilton, and 2022 as well. He did a bit better in 23. I'll give him credit for that. But 2022 and 2024, like, he just massively underwhelming for a driver who supposedly is one of the greats, right? And statistically is the greatest. So he just hasn't shown anything amazing. like he got the win in Belgium due to George Russell's penalty a few years back. And he got the win in Silverstone last year, I believe. Um, and that's about it. And you compare that to George Russell when they were teammates. I know George Russell had a really scrappy 2023, but on pure pace, he was better than Hamilton. And that's not necessarily the biggest negative because George Russell is a very good driver. But I think coming into Ferrari, it's just continued that same sort of chronic like lack of consistency, I suppose, in the sense that there hasn't really ever been a race or qualifying session this year where you think Hamilton's on it, like Hamilton could do this. You just always look at Hamilton and he's consistently sort of like sixth or seventh or out in Q2. Like, it's just for a Ferrari driver. I know the Ferrari is like the fourth best car this year, but it's just not good enough. And especially for such a high profile driver as well. Because you look at when Carlos Sainz was there, I think you could comfortably say Charles Leclerc was the better driver than Carlos Sainz. However, Carlos Sainz still was very close to Charles and often outperformed him. 2021, he beat him in the standings. 2022 was a bit of an off year for Carlos. But 23 and 24, very strong years. And still holds the most recent Ferrari win, I believe. So, when you consider that he's been replaced by Lewis Hamilton, I just think it's completely underwhelming and just not good enough. And when you look at their junior driver in Oliver Bearman, who, yes, it's a sort of knee-jerk reaction in the sense that he's had two very strong races in a row, and the rest of the season hasn't been like that. But what any team is looking for in a junior driver is potential, and the last two races is exactly that for Oliver Bearman. Potential. 4th place in Mexico, 6th place in Brazil, in a Haas, where his experienced teammate, Esteban Ocon, is comfortably finishing behind him. I think Ferrari definitely should be looking at Bearman. Definitely not as soon as 2026, because the one thing I'll give to Hamilton's credit is I don't think the ground effect cars suit him at all. Because it's one of two reasons. You either say Hamilton completely fell off in 2022, or you say since 2022 he struggled with the ground effect cars, which I lean to a bit more. I think it's a combination of both, but I do acknowledge that as being a reason. But I just think 2027, if Hamilton's still doing these kind of performances, still behind Charles Leclerc, I think you have to consider Bearman getting that seat. Because you also need to consider how much money is Ferrari spending on Hamilton for him to literally not be doing anything in sessions. Like, I'm sure whilst money isn't ever going to be a massive concern for Ferrari, it's still going to be nicer to have a rookie who doesn't have this massive expectation of performing. Because when Hamilton doesn't perform, it makes way bigger headlines than if you got Bearman in the car and he was off of Leclerc's pace. It makes a complete headache and massive questions for Ferrari having Lewis Hamilton this mediocre. And I just think I really hope next year he's in contention for some sort of maybe not the title. I don't know if Ferrari will be the fastest car next year, but at least race wins next year. Because just seeing Hamilton there at this point, it doesn't feel fair that he's got a seat in one of the best teams on the grid, and he's an experienced driver and should be doing better, but he's not. It just feels unfair to the rookies who could be doing a better job. Because say what you will about Red Bull and how that second seat is toxic, at least they're giving other drivers a chance, right? But if they keep Hamilton for years going on, and you're missing out on talent like Oliver Bearman, I just think it's a bad decision by Ferrari if they ignore that. So I think definitely with performances like this and stark contrast between Hamilton and Bearman, I do believe that Bearman has a very, very good shout of a 2027 Ferrari seat if he continues this. And you know what? He very much deserves it. He's in contention for sort of like best rookie of the year at this point now. It's definitely between him, Hadjar, and Antonelli. However, I think Hadjar's kind of fallen off recently. He's still doing very good, but you know, it's been a bit worse compared to his earlier season headlines. And then Antonelli, I suppose, is picking up the performance at this point. So I'd say it's between those three for Rookie of the Year. And I think very, very strong season from Bearman, and the kind of season that's going to get big teams certainly eyeing him up. So very, very good news for him, I'd say. And that goes on to my... If you've watched my other video, which if you haven't, I do recommend you do, my rankings based off of average form. And this kind of goes into what I was saying with Bearman, for example, having very good peaks in the season, but overall his ranking more reflects how his season has been as a whole. And this is, as you can see, the rankings last week after Mexico, and I'm going to move on to the current one. So if you want to flick back and forth between the two to see the changes, then by all means. But that's last week, and the changes this week look like this, where you can see the performances from Hulkenberg and Bearman and Lawson have increased their averages by quite a decent amount, actually. But then you've also got the drivers who aren't performing, such as Tsunoda, Stroll, Bortoleto, and they've actually lost a decent bit, and Hamilton too, and Leclerc with the DNF. And I think quite the sort of order of this, just it still looks right. I think the only sort of outlier maybe is Bortoleto, or maybe Gasly too. I think they should be a little bit higher, and it's kind of weighted down by like how many sort of bad races Bortoleto has had in terms of like out of his control. But not really any changes in the top 10, in fact none. It's mostly the drivers below that. But I think Tsunoda, after such a terrible weekend, looking like he's going to drop behind Bearman and Lawson very soon. And yeah, speaking on that briefly, I mean, what a terrible weekend. And I think the car is terrible, right? It looked really, really bad, and that's why Tsunoda has struggled so much more this weekend. But I don't know, the 10-second penalty, I think, was deserved. He just took out Stroll. But then also the team just failing to do a 10-second penalty in the pits. It just completely... It doesn't flatten him at all. It feels like whenever he's having a not great race, it's exemplified by Red Bull just messing something up. And it just makes it sort of like this massive cacophony of errors that ends up with Tsunoda looking like the worst driver in the world. Whereas I think without that crash into Stroll, he was on the same strategy as Max, and I think he could have had a decent performance, maybe close to the top 10 too, but just no, and that's really taken a hit to his score here. So feel free to analyse this, like I say, pause if you want, but those are sort of the main changes. Obviously Gasly's gained one as well, having a very strong weekend. So that's that. And then I'll move on to my predictions, which is probably the bit most people skip to. Or maybe not, I don't know. But starting with my sprint qualifying predictions, I did okay. I say that, I didn't really, but at least I got Piastri in the right position. I'll take that. Compared to last week where I got none, I think that's okay-ish. But then moving on to the sprint predictions, again, I get one driver right. I was obviously very foolish to think Norris would have a bad sprint, and also very, very stupid to think Ferrari would be any good this weekend. So that's great. And then moving on to the qualifying predictions, again, got one right in Lando Norris, but way too much confidence in Ferrari, it would seem, just especially Lewis Hamilton. But I was, and Max Verstappen too. I couldn't be much further off with that. But at least I'm getting some right. Like, again, if you haven't seen Mexico's review, I did terrible in Mexico. But going on to the race predictions, even worse. I mean, look, it was actually kind of close to the top three. If Verstappen stayed out and miraculously defended, and Piastri actually locked in and overtook the Mercedes, then, it could have happened. But no, I just end up being way off again. And again, double Ferrari DNF. Awesome. Really great, that. So that kind of ends up with my stroll of the week as well being terrible. Like, oh god, it's not been a good weekend for predictions, has it? I mean, it's been better than last week, just from the sense that last week I literally got nothing right, apart from the general prediction. But that's not going to stay the same this week, because I was massively wrong with it again. So, that's amazing. And that ends up with the scores looking like 2.5 for qualifying, 3/4 for race, 0 for stroll, 0 for general predictions, 2.5 for both the sprint quali and the sprint race, and that puts my total to 8.25 this week and 11.75 overall. Which, you know what? It's better than last week. Much better than last week. Yes, I had 2 extra sessions to predict on, but we don't count that. Like, I did better, kind of. So yeah, not the greatest week for predictions, but I just put too much confidence in Ferrari, as any Ferrari fan does. So that's about that, and that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this race review. Like I said at the beginning, if you enjoyed, like and subscribe, please. And I will see you guys for Las Vegas, I think. I don't believe I'll make any other videos until then, unless something crazy in the media happens. But yeah, looking forward to Las Vegas. I think it like the last 2 years, it'll be a very chaotic race. I'm not particularly looking forward to waking up early in the morning, but then again, so many fans have to do that in other countries, so I won't complain too much. But yeah, I think next week, very crucial for the championship, and should be an interesting race. And I hope you guys have a great 2 weeks, I think it's until Las Vegas. So have a great 2 weeks, and I will see you for my Las Vegas preview video. So thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.